Hello, I'm Richard Howe. Welcome to today's virtual tour. In honor of Memorial Day, the title of today's talk is Monuments and Memorial Day. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the veterans organizations of Lowell observe Memorial Day in recent years. Now, there's some dispute about the origin of where and when Memorial Day started, but one thing there is no dispute about is that it was intended as a way of honoring those who gave their life while serving in the military forces of the United States. So the veterans organizations of Lowell maintain that tradition. On the Sunday before Memorial Day, for as long as I remember, the different organizations all gather at the Ladd and Whitney Monument in front of City Hall. This is an iconic monument in Lowell. It's named for Luther Ladd and Addison Whitney, two young mill workers who were the first U.S. soldiers to be killed by enemy fire in the United States Civil War. And they're actually buried beneath this monument. So it's really sacred ground. So what happens is a representative of each member organization of the Greater Lowell Veterans Council steps up to the podium and reads the names of the members of that group who have passed away since the last Memorial Day. Now here's Bob Cronin, the past commander of the Merrimack Valley Vietnam veterans, reading the roster of deceased members from a few years ago, Memorial Day. So then after all of the organizations have read the names of their deceased members, a wreath is placed at the monument, and then a firing squad fires a salute, and then a bugler plays taps. And that's the conclusion of this part of the ceremony. Everyone then adjourns and reconvenes at the Lowell Memorial Auditorium. In past years, if the weather is nice, everyone's gathered on the front steps and there's a number of speeches, both by veterans and political figures. And that's followed by another more wreaths being laid on the monuments around the Lowell Memorial Auditorium, another gun salute, and taps is played. And there's also a thing called the water ceremony that takes place on the Pearl Harbor Memorial Bridge, which takes East Merrimack Street over the Concord River right in front of the auditorium. Everyone who attends the ceremony is given a flower, and they all gather along the railing of the bridge, and at the proper moment they cast the flowers into the water and watch them float with the current out to the Merrimack. And the symbolism of the water ceremony is to remember those who died at sea. And it's thought that because their bodies were lost, they don't have a known grave where people can go and decorate with flowers, as is often the case on Memorial Day. And so the water ceremony is a stand-in for that. Now, besides just on Memorial Day, the city of Lowell and its people honor veterans by naming things for them. And what I'm going to do now is go through a half dozen or so examples of things that have been named for veterans and tell the story of the soldiers and sailors whose names are affixed to these places. You may recognize this. It's on Plain Street, across from Target. This is the Walker Rogers Veterans of Foreign War Post 662. And veterans organizations that were formed after World War I and World War II began a practice of not only having a numeric designator, this is post 662 of the VFW, but also adopting the name of one or more soldiers or sailors from that community whose stories provide particular inspiration. Now, in the case of post 662, Walker Rogers is actually two different people. First is Ralph Walker, who was a sergeant in the Massachusetts National Guard from Lowell, who was mobilized and sent to Cuba during the Spanish-American War. And there he died of malaria. The second one, Rogers, is named for a sailor, Fireman Third Class George Francis Rogers. He was a crew member aboard the USS Jacob Jones, which was torpedoed by a German submarine on December 6, 1917. And Rogers and 17 of his fellow crew members lost their lives during that engagement. We also have a bridge named after a veteran. This is the Willette Bridge. It carries Aiken Street over the Merrimack River from the Acre to Centerville. And it is named for Joseph R. Willette, who was a private first class in the U.S. Army's 2nd Infantry Division. He was stationed in Korea when the North Koreans attacked. He was only 20 years old, but his unit was cut off and surrounded. And Willette performed countless acts of heroism that helped the rest of his platoon survive the battle, but it cost him his life. So because of his heroism, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously, which means he wasn't alive to receive it. And the medal itself was presented by the Army Chief of Staff, General Omar Bradley, to Willette's mother. The bridge was named for Willette in 1953. And there's a picture of Joseph Willette. He was only 20 when he was killed in action. And this is a display at the Lowell Memorial Auditorium where Willette's family actually donated the medal to the Veterans Council for display in the auditorium. So if you go there, you'll be able to see Willette's picture and his medal. There's also a school in Lowell named for veterans. This is the Shaughnessy School at 1158 Gorham Street, up across from St. Patrick's Cemetery. It's named for First Lieutenant John J. Shaughnessy, who was a platoon leader in Company H, 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division. He was killed in action on D-Day on Omaha Beach with the rest of the 1st Infantry Division that invaded France that day. He was buried in France initially, but in 1947, his body was exhumed and brought back to Lowell. There's a picture of Shaughnessy, who was 27 years old when he died, and there's his grave in St. Patrick's Cemetery. The school was constructed the initial Shaughnessy School was constructed in 1957, and that's when it was named for him. And the older school was torn down and rebuilt reopened in 1991 as the current Shaughnessy School. We also have a street named after an Army veteran, and that's Arcand Drive. This is the side of the Ladd and Whitney Monument, but the boulder monument in front of us is to Donald Arcand. So Arcand Drive connects Merrimack Street to Father Morissette Boulevard down near the Songus Arena. It was constructed in 1969 as part of the urban renewal, the Northern Canal Urban Renewal Project that tore down much of Little Canada and the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. Donald Arcand was a graduate of St. Joseph's High School. He lived in Ford Street, which was part of Little Canada. When he graduated from high school in 1963, he volunteered for the Army. He was an infantryman, but he was assigned to an aviation battalion where he became a door gunner on a helicopter. There's a picture of him graduation. And in 1965, his helicopter was hit by enemy fire. It exploded in midair, and he and the rest of the crew all died. His body was recovered. His funeral took place at St. John Baptiste Church, and he was buried in St. Joseph's Cemetery. And what happened was Arcand Drive, it was an unnamed road, And because so much of the French neighborhood, Little Canada, was disrupted, the city planners offered the French community the opportunity to choose the name of somebody to affix to this road. And there were a number of either political figures of Franco-Americans or prominent business people, but the Franco community, which has always had deep respect for veterans, chose instead to name it for this 19-year-old Donald Arcand, who was killed. He was the first Lowell soldier to be killed in the Vietnam War. There's the type of helicopter that he was a crew member on. And this is a view across the Merrimack River looking north to the stage. In the left-hand side is called the Sampus Pavilion. But this whole stretch of grass and walkway that runs along that part of the north bank of the Merrimack is called the Vandenberg Esplanade. It's actually named for Hoyt Vandenberg, this man here, who lived in Lowell. He was a graduate of Lowell High School. He went to West Point. He became a pilot in the United States Army Air Force, and he rose to very high. He became a general during World War II. He was in command of large formations of heavy bombers that were attacking Germany from England. After the war, he had a number of interesting assignments. In 1946, he was named the second director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA didn't exist until after World War II, and President Truman created it, and he named Vandenberg to be its head. And then shortly after that, when the United States Air Force was formed by being carved out of the United States Army Air Force, Vandenberg became the first chief of staff of the Air Force. He served in that role from 1947 to 1953, and he was contracted cancer, and he retired, and he died the next year in 1954. Now, besides, one of the reasons Hoyt Vandenberg lived in Lowell was that his family came to stay with his great uncle. This is Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. And that great uncle was Eli Hoyt. Well, you might have heard his name before in connection with Freeman Shedd, the man that Shedd Park is named after. Shedd and Hoyt were boyhood friends. They met while working at a drugstore, and Hoyt concocted this cologne called Hoyt's German Cologne, which became hugely popular around the United States. It made Hoyt and Shedd quite a bit of money. Now, when Hoyt's sister had her two sons, the Vandenbergs. She named them Hoyt and Shedd after the two business partners. So Hoyt Vandenberg went on to become the chief of staff of the Air Force. Then if you spend any time in Lowell, you've noticed a lot of these black signs with white lettering and gold stars affixed to telephone poles and signs at intersections around the city. There's a long-standing practice of naming squares, meaning the intersection of two or more streets. For many of them are named for soldiers who have died in battle, but others are named for people who performed noteworthy service in the military. Now, an example of this type of square is Manuel Martin. He came to the United States with his family from Brazil in the years before World War I, and they lived at number 1 Charles Street, right at the intersection of Charles and Central Street. And young Manuel, when he was 16, 17, he worked as a carpenter. Then in April of 1917, he joined the Massachusetts Army National Guard. When his unit was mobilized, it became part of the 26th Division, which was sent to France, and the 26th Division, the Yankee division of the National Guard, saw more combat than any other division, any other National Guard division in the United States Army during World War I. And it was while serving with that outfit that Manuel Martin was killed by enemy fire on April 13th, 1918 in France. He was just 18 years old. This is the where the Manuel Martin Square is. It's at Charles Street and Central Street. There is a picture of young Manuel Martin. He's buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery. And then we have monuments that are dedicated to soldiers and sailors. This one is to George Charette. He was a sailor. He was born in Lowell. He joined the United States Navy. He was a gunner's mate, and he was assigned to a battleship during the Spanish-American War. And this was a time, it was a transition from into the modern era of battle. And the American fleet had the Spanish fleet trapped in Santiago Harbor. But the American fleet had to stay outside the harbor to ensure that the Spanish fleet didn't come out and attack the transports that were landing troops on the island elsewhere. So the commander, Admiral Sampson, wanted to bottle up the Spanish fleet inside the harbor. So he selected a young officer in whom he had a lot of faith. And he told him that he wanted him to take an old Navy cargo ship, which coincidentally was called the USS Merrimack, take a small crew of 8 men, 8 sailors, load the Merrimack up with explosive charges, sail it into the mouth of the channel that led out of the harbor at Santiago Harbor, and then sink it. And this naval officer's name was Richmond Hobson, and his 9 volunteers were then supposed to swim back out and be picked up by the American fleet. Well, and this is a picture of George Charette, and Hobson survived. In fact, all 10 of them survived the sinking of the Merrimack, and there's a picture of the Merrimack. However, their mission was not a success as they sailed towards the narrowest part of the channel. The Spanish forts that guarded the opening spotted the ship and pummeled it with cannon fire, and they damaged it so badly that it sank on its own outside of the main part of the channel, and it wasn't able to block anything. Strangely enough, none of the sailors on board were injured. They all survived. They all abandoned ship. They were picked up by the Spanish Navy and taken captive. However, because of their bravery, this action was like a throwback to the age of sail. They were actually treated like heroes by the Spanish, and they were wined and dined. They weren't held in really tough captivity. They were only held for about 10 days until the war ended, and they were exchanged. And so for his heroism, Charette and all the other men who volunteered that night were awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Charette remained in the Navy till the 1920s. When he retired, he came back to Lowell. He died in 1938, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia. So here's his grave. So those are just some examples of how the city of Lowell honors veterans, and there's perhaps 500 of these veterans monuments throughout the city. There's no comprehensive list, but we're working hard to fix that. So stay tuned for more information about these veteran squares and monuments. And with that, I want to close by reading a poem that was written by the aunt of John J. Shaughnessy. If you remember, Shaughnessy was the 27-year-old lieutenant who lived up on Gorham Street with his family, who died during the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. He had an aunt who was a nun, Sister Marcella O'Donnell of the Sisters of Mary. She was posted in Binghamton, New York. She wrote this poem right after the war, while Shaughnessy was still buried in France. As I mentioned earlier, in 1947, his body was brought back to Lowell. But here's the poem by Sister Marcella O'Donnell. It's called Victory. Somewhere in France he is sleeping, under sacred Normandy's moon, our hero whose flower of manhood was shipped off for heaven last June. There in the green of the hillside, they laid him beside his men. Nothing shall shatter his slumber, no one shall hurt him again. Winds sigh the chant of his requiem, moonlight illumines his cross. Soft, helpless rain like our teardrops echoes the pain of his loss. Yet his is the truest triumph. Death brings the perfect peace. The living will always be militant till life and its struggles cease. So thank you all for watching. Please have an enjoyable, restful, and contemplative Memorial Day.